BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. In this episode I will be responding to a new take on the 2007 Zodiac film from David Fincher, looking at a new Zodiac killer suspect, as well as continuing the discussions on handwriting analysis. But I have a couple pieces of Zodiac killer news that I would like to discuss with you. The first is that there is a new video about the Zodiac killer on the channel The French Wrecking Crew, run by Jerome. It also discusses Susan Atkins from the Manson family. There's lots of Zodiac killer content on the channel New Cokes 2024, run by Vincent McConnell, and I invite you to check out his stuff. There's a lot of good commentary from Vincent. He's a very insightful individual, and I follow the group The Zodiac Killer and Me on Facebook, and I'll actually share a photo from that one. This is a photo of the suspect that is discussed in that group, Loring Dale Hill. He's the suspect of Melissa Rose Tappa and Jeff Thornton, aka Thornton Daniel Jeffrey, and Melissa is the webmaster of ZodiacKillerBomb.com. And I've interviewed them. I've interviewed Melissa a couple times for Black Box Online Radio, and you can find those in the search bar. But in this episode, I want to share the announcement that in September of this year, Melissa and Jeff will participate in a meeting with the FBI office in San Francisco to discuss their Zodiac killer findings. And I wish them nothing but the best. And they are going to, hopefully get some answers about their Zodiac killer suspect, Loring Dale Hill. And other people have approached me with some similar stories over the years that they have gotten in touch with members of law enforcement. Sometimes it's the FBI, but other times it's places like the Vallejo Police Department. They just simply wanted law enforcement to examine their findings, and they say that they will accept the result no matter what. But most importantly, they believe that they have created a suspect profile that is worthy of examination, and that's what they're looking for. Just someone to give it an honest take, someone in law enforcement to give their honest take on the subject. And I will share any updates that I can from their journey here on Black Box Online Radio. And as I said, you can also visit ZodiacKillerBomb.com and the Zodiac Killer and Me on Facebook. But I said I wanted to talk about the 2007 Zodiac movie that was directed by David Fincher and starring Jake Gyllenhaal, who played Robert Graysmith. And I read a lot about the Zodiac Killer online, and I found this one website that shared the production notes from the movie Zodiac, and I was expecting it to be a movie review or some type of synopsis, but it turned out it was the production notes for the movie, which more or less told a lot of stories about how Jake Gyllenhaal and David Fincher were preparing for the creation of the film. And it was available from the Cannes Film Festival website, and it's about 77 pages long. And I'll be discussing some observations from it here on Zodiac Monday. The first is, no matter what, even if it is a set of production notes, it wants to get the reader's attention. And they do this by saying that no criminal since Jack the Ripper wrote taunting letters taking credit for his crimes. And of course, that's one way to get a lot of attention, but it's simply just not true. And I don't mean to go off on some giant spiel about this. You guys know that I talk about Jack the Ripper every Wednesday here on Black Box Online Radio, Ripper Wednesday, but I've also talked about a lot of other cases that have involved serial killers that write letters taking credit for their crimes. Firstly, we have the Axeman of New Orleans in 1912, and there is a letter where there's the famous saying, better have a jazz band playing, or the Axeman will go on a rampage. And then there's also the Black Dahlia Avenger letters. Even the Phantom Killer in 1946 has letters that could be attributed to the killer, and I'm going to be very honest with you. I think that a lot of those letters are hoaxes, especially the Axeman letter, but I also think the Ripper letters were also hoaxes, and those weren't actually written by the killer. But with the 3X killer of the 1930s, that is another murderer who killed at least 2 people and wrote letters taking credit for the crimes. Absolutely, there are murderers and criminals who write letters taking credit for what they're doing. It just doesn't happen extremely frequently. But there are lots of case examples. With the Zodiac Killer, though, I've begun to realize that this is a very clear case where there's a very high chance that the killer actually did write the letters, and that there's either a single killer or a central planning mind, and I've said that almost throughout my entire journey. even if somebody is going to be defending something like the Zodiac Killer hoax theory, then there's also this thing we would have to keep in mind, and that is that there was most likely a central planning figure. And Michael Butterfield of ZodiacKillerFacts.com perhaps said it the best. Even if you do entertain the idea that the Zodiac Killer was all a giant hoax, well, there still was a Zodiac. It's just he's not the Zodiac Killer, he's the Zodiac co-conspirator. And the Zodiac began his letters with what? This is the Zodiac speaking. So there still was a Zodiac. The Zodiac was a serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69, and whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And a lot of people look toward Robert Graysmith and his 1986 book Zodiac for the source material into their investigations. Many, but not all. And Jake Gyllenhaal played Robert Graysmith in the 2007 film, and one thing that he wanted to do that's discussed in the production notes is he wanted to meet Robert Graysmith, and he wanted to learn about his mannerisms, he wanted to learn about his behavior, everything about him, because he's going to be playing him in the movie, so he wanted to just recreate as much of Graysmith as possible. And so Jake Gyllenhaal was aware that not only was Robert Graysmith the author of Zodiac and Zodiac Unmasked, but he also was the author of other true crime books, and he expected that he was going to meet a guy that was hard-boiled or rough-edged, because if he's going to be writing all these stories about people being murdered or other types of criminal behavior, then he must be somewhat hard-boiled and rough-edged, right? But he met Robert Graysmith for the first time, and the first word, this is a quotation from Jake Gyllenhaal, is the first adjective that he uses to describe Robert Graysmith is sweet. He says something to the effect of, he was a sweet, friendly individual. And, I mean, to be honest with you, I'm just sharing a moment of pure honesty. If Jake Gyllenhaal were ever to meet me and he would be like, Ned DeHaan from BlackBoxOnlineRadio, he's a sweet guy, I would probably go to Starbucks, get a double espresso, sit out in the sun and just rethink my life in a somber way. But I digress from that, because I think that what he's trying to say is that Robert Graysmith is somebody who perhaps people would expect maybe he is a little bit on the dark side, talking about all of these murderous stories, but in all reality he is not. And the next line that is discussed in the production notes is, a lot of people then have misconceptions about Graysmith, and they want to disprove Graysmith, maybe because they do not like him. And I don't really think that that's the reason at all, because Robert Graysmith is mostly just recognized as an entertainment figure. He is somebody who is writing books that are meant to be pop true crime. And we have pop psychology, we have pop culture, right? Pop true crime. They aren't necessarily meant to be taken seriously, because he tries to write them the way that he wrote Zodiac, blending the facts and fiction together. And Thomas Henry Horan has been his largest critic, and he said that the movie Zodiac from 2007 is a meta-narrative. It's the story of how the story was written, the story of how the book Zodiac was written. But one thing that is discussed in the production notes of the film is that not only were they trying to use the source material as the book Zodiac and Robert Graysmith writing Zodiac, they also wanted to incorporate elements of the book Zodiac Unmasked. It's actually a double meta-narrative, the story of how two books were written, Zodiac and Zodiac Unmasked, although Zodiac is definitely the forefront of it, and that's what you really see on film. But there are lots of ideas from Zodiac Unmasked that are included there, because if you read the book Zodiac Unmasked by Robert Graysmith, it's all about how Graysmith is just digging deeper and deeper into the life of the prime suspect, Arthur Lee Allen. And these production notes also get into the true crime aspect of it, because they talk about certain aspects of the case. The Zodiac Killer was not only a serial killer, he wrote these letters and cryptograms, and he created the ciphers. And the 408 cipher was the first one that was solved, the one that says, I like killing people because it's so much fun. And there's a discussion on the Z18 code in the production notes. The final line of the 408 cipher has never been uncoded. It's just an assembly of letters that aren't really done in a coherent way, and no one really knows what it means. But one thing that Robert Graysmith was promoting in both of his Zodiac books is that it means Robert Emmett the Hippie. And it's discussed in the production notes that there are a couple reasons for this, and I should also point out there's a discussion in Zodiac Unmasked about this, and Robert Graysmith is telling the story of reuniting with Paul Avery in the 1980s, sitting down with the journalist Paul Avery, who covered the story as a reporter, and they're talking about the Z18 code, and Graysmith just asked Paul Avery, what do you think the Z18 means? You've had, many years now to think about it. what do you think that actually stood for, if it stood for anything at all? And what Paul Avery says on Zodiac Unmasked is, I think it's Robert Emmett. Now, Paul Avery wasn't the first person to say that, but that's another thing that's discussed in the production notes. The solution to the Z18 code could be Robert Emmett the Hippie. And a lot of people have been very dismissive of this. I mean, I mentioned Thomas Henry Horan, but also Richard Grinnell of ZodiacCiphers.com does not believe that the Z18 code has any real meaning. And when you look at them, the reason why they think it means Robert Emmett the Hippie is that, again, Graysmith's suspect is Arthur Lee Allen, the prime suspect, the only suspect to be publicly identified by law enforcement, and Arthur Lee Allen knew an individual named Robert Emmett Rotifer, and I've talked about him before on the channel, and he was actually interviewed by law enforcement. He was in Germany at the time, and somebody even flew to Germany to interview him, and they tell the story of this in the production notes, and it's more or less assembling things in a chronological order so you can see the thought process. And as I said, to the credit of Robert Graysmith, I think he's actually reasonably good at this from reading his books in the past, and he's good at arranging things in a way that makes sense in a sequential fashion. Like, I've talked about some other things in previous episodes, but I want to stay on this point. Okay, so, the Zodiac is talking about hunting people for sport, and he's created this serial killer persona, and Arthur Lee Allen was somebody who knew a guy named Robert Emmett Rotifer, and somebody even recognized Robert Emmett the Hippie. They're just like, I know exactly who that would be. Robert Emmett Rotifer. He was somebody who was involved with diving. Arthur Lee Allen was involved with diving. But Arthur Lee Allen really did not like him. Robert Emmett Rotifer didn't like him. So, putting somebody's name as the solution, Robert Emmett the Hippie, whom he did not like. He's not going to put his own name into the cipher. If anyway, some way, somehow, someone was able to figure it out, then it would just lead back to somebody whom he did not like. Something vengeful, but also something that would never actually tie back to the real killer. Now, I don't know what you guys think about that. I mean, I can comprehend the thought process that somebody's in Arthur Lee Allen's circle does have a name that would match up almost to the Z18 code. Almost, but not perfectly. But you can always weigh in on the comment section about what you think about the meaning of the Z18 code is. One that was discussed from one of you guys in the comment section in the past I thought was very interesting was Playtime said that there are 18 symbols in the Z18 code, right? But 5 of them are the letter E. And the Zodiac Killer wrote the My Name Is cipher, which had 13 symbols. And what he was saying is, maybe that's actually the killer's name and that the E's are spaces. If you were to take away the 5 E's and you're left with 13 symbols, which could actually have the real killer's name. But I've always liked hearing about what people think in regards to the Z18, even if they simply think that it's just done as a way to confuse cryptographers, because if you were to add, let's see, 408 minus 11, there would be 309, oh, I'm so bad at math, there would be 398 symbols, 99 symbols, 97, I don't know any math, I'm not joking, but then that would kind of confuse people, or it would give away the solution, because you would know which part of the 3-part cipher needs to come last. And then, if by filling that into an even number, 408, then you would not necessarily know which part of the 3-part cryptogram would need to go first. And the Zodiac divided the cipher into thirds and mailed it to 3 newspapers, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. Now, there's another source that I've been looking at, and that is, I've been talking to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, Golden State Killer connection for a couple weeks now, and I have to give a shout out to Lisa once again, who has reawakened my interest in this particular subject. And the most famous book that has been written about this comes to us from Ann Penn, called What If? Golden State Killer Zodiac Solved. And before I read a book, I usually like to pull up a free sample from Kindle, and I pulled up the sample of Ann Penn's Zodiac. Golden State Killer Zodiac Solved. It's always hard for me to say the title of that book, because no matter which way you do it, it all seems like it sounds right. And I was reading through that one, and it is heavily focused on the Golden State Killer and his crimes that were committed outside of the Zodiac crime spree in 1968 and 69. And Ann Penn does have a lot of observations about the pre-Zodiac murders in the 1960s. But when I was reading the free sample, there was only one mention of the actual Zodiac killer, and she has a suspect named Joseph D'Angelo, but I was really just looking for the hard parts about the Zodiac. Like, what is she saying about the Zodiac killer? And at the very end, on the very last page, there is one statement about the Zodiac that I thought was rather insightful, and that is that the Zodiac killer most likely left clues behind that had meaning to him that he would understand, but other people would not understand. And I think that's a great way of putting it. I've thought that for a very long time, and I'm not 100% convinced if that's what the Zodiac did with everything, but when you look at some of the artistic choices that the Zodiac would make, maybe the symbols on the Halloween card, maybe the symbols on the Exorcist letter, maybe even some other things like the Z18 code, the Zodiac might have left clues that could be assembled in a way that you'd have to know his method to do that. And it wouldn't be a conventional method that anyone could figure out. It would be things that only he would figure out, because it's giving people a little bit, but never giving them everything, because the Zodiac just doesn't flat out give you his identity. And if anything, I thought that was an interesting and insightful statement, but I don't think I'm going to be reading the entirety of Ann Penn's book, What If Golden State Killer Zodiac Solved, because I think that it's going to be much more focused just on the life and times of Joseph D'Angelo, and perhaps we could talk about that in a Golden State Killer episode. But for Zodiac Monday, I think that Joseph D'Angelo is mostly a dead-end suspect, but if you want to dispute with that, you can put that in the comments section down below. I know Lisa is going to have a lot of things to say about this, and also if there are other suspects that you want to hear about, you can make requests and share some things in the comments section. You can also hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. I also want to remind you guys that there are going to be a lot more things happening on Black Box Online Radio. On Tuesday this week, I'm hoping to do an episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning where I go live. For this summer of 2024, I'm hoping to go live every Tuesday and Thursday. Going to be trying to do this at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time, and that'll be, of course, corresponding to Pacific, Mountain, and Central Time as well. Corresponding, that is. But yeah, doing True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, so feel free to tune in and you can share anything you want about any true crime case. And one thing that I've been planning on doing is going through the John Douglas books from the FBI profiler John Douglas, and I'm going to be starting with the cases that haunt us for several different reasons. And I'm going to do a multi-part discussion on that, but that will most likely begin on the Thursday episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. So feel free to stop on by if you want to share anything you want about the Zodiac Killer and other true crime stories here on Black Box Online Radio. I already talked to you guys about Ripper Wednesday, but in addition to that, I also do a segment about D.B. Cooper every Friday, Cooper Friday, of course. And right now, I would like to switch gears and talk about a new Zodiac Killer suspect. And this one was brought to my attention from Chad Burke. Chad Burke is perhaps most well known for discussing the Zodiac Killer's codes, particularly the Z13, but he was proposing a suspect recently named William Leslie Arnold, who went by the alias John Damon. And I also want to cite a particular video out there that is done by the channel Villain Catcher, that shared a lot of information about John Damon, as well as Dr. Todd Grande's channel. He also did a video on him as well. And the long story short is that, well, let's just call him Les Arnold. His name was William Leslie Arnold, but he went by the name Les from his middle name, a variant of his middle name, and he was a real convicted murderer who killed his parents because he wanted to take the car to go on a date with a girl, take her to the drive-in, and he buried their bodies in the backyard. And before you think that, okay, this sounds like a bunch of wild stuff, there's even a show out there called Buried in the Backyard, because people do this a lot. And, I mean, does it sound like the Zodiac Killer? Well, the fact of the matter is that William Leslie Arnold was a real killer. Some people are very critical of suspects that get accused of being the Zodiac Killer when they've never been accused of anything other than a parking ticket. So, he was a convicted murderer. Then he goes on the run after he's murdered his parents. He's apprehended by the police. He's taken to jail, and then he breaks out of jail. So, he breaks out of the jail with another person, and they part ways, and William Leslie Arnold goes to Chicago, Illinois. He gets married, and he actually gets married multiple times in his life. But in 1967, he leaves Chicago, and he moves to California, 1 year before the Zodiac crimes took place. Then, at some time after 1968-69, he moves to Florida, and then from Florida he moves to New Zealand. And it appears that he's a guy who's always on the run and always trying to leave his life behind, because he moves to New Zealand, back to America, back to New Zealand, and then eventually to Australia, and he ultimately settles in Queensland, Australia, where he would pass away. And he was actually only discovered because of DNA testing posthumously. Like, after he died, his son found out that he was a convicted murderer who had the name William Leslie Arnold. He simply told his family that he was an orphan, but based on his movements, I think that it's really quite obvious in retrospect that he was a criminal who was constantly on the run. Now again, I will approach this suspect with an open mind. William Leslie Arnold was born on August 28th of 1942, so I said that I'm really bad at math, but that would mean that he would be 26, 27 for the duration of Zodiac activity, and that's not a completely unreasonable age. Convicted murderer, also somebody who's on the run, who's already experienced what murder is like, and someone who maybe would have a reason to try and hide his identity. But the crimes that were committed by William Leslie Arnold, well, let's just read through some of this stuff. William Leslie Arnold used the alias John Vincent Damon. He was an American murderer. In 1958, at the age of 16, he murdered his parents and buried them in the backyard of the family home in Omaha, Nebraska. He was sentenced to life in prison in 1959. In 1967, he and another inmate escaped from prison, and that was the last successful escape from a Nebraska penitentiary. He moved to California, Florida, and eventually New Zealand in 1978. In 2010, he died in Tamborine Mountain, Australia, near Queensland, where he was living under the alias John Damon. He was known as Les Arnold, and his father, Bill Arnold, owned the Omaha region of Watkins Products, a direct sales company, while his mother, Opal, was a homemaker. Neighbors described him as high-strung and stated that he had a temper, but also that he was intelligent, and that he was in the ROTC and a B- student. Well, I mean, ROTC, B- student, I think that all matches up with the Zodiac Killer. The hot temper thing, though, I'm not completely convinced of that, because some people are out there thinking that the Zodiac Killer might have been the nicest guy in the world in public. Like, when people would know him, they would think, he's completely harmless. No, he would never hurt a fly. But then we have other Zodiac Killer suspects who are reported to be extremely filled with rage. Like, the Golden State Killer was reported to just snap at odd times. And then you also have people out there who are a little bit more on the darker side. Like, what was said about Bruce Davis of the Manson family is that he was the scariest of them all. It's just he didn't show it all the time. And then you have people like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who goes on to become a Zodiac Killer suspect as well. He would be somebody who, again, is mostly non-threatening to people, but then when people aren't watching, he would just kind of go after people's homes with a pickaxe or something when he was living in Montana. So I'm not completely convinced that the Zodiac had a hot temper. The Zodiac might have been able to hide his temper really well and then just release it at calculated moments, and then other people just have this belief about serial killers that they don't show it to anyone except when they're committing the murders. It's internalizing the rage. But what do you think about that? Do you think the Zodiac Killer was hot-tempered when he was around other people, or do you think he put on the nice guy facade? Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. In 1958, at the age of 16, he murdered his parents. Say, okay, we read that. He hid their bodies in the basement first, and then buried them in the backyard. He took his younger brother, who did not know about the murders, to a neighbor's house before digging the trench to bury the bodies. He then took his girlfriend to the movies with the car. After the killings, Arnold lived at the house, still attending school, and telling the parents that he had merely gone on a trip. And from the video that I was watching on Villain Catcher, he said that his father owned a business, and William Arnold actually set it up, so he made it look like they were open for business, even though just no one was responding to things. So he put a lot of effort into this. Overall, though, I can also see some of the reasons why Chad Burke was pointing out that he matches some facial similarities to the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch. Now, you might notice that he has some very noticeably wide ears, which have not exactly been mentioned in any of the witness reports, and that's just one thing that I want to point out. And also, he has a particularly different hairline than that of the composite sketch, but I was just saying on the most recent Zodiac Monday that I don't think the sketch is a perfect match to what the killer truly looked like. But overall, I'm thinking that this guy is a little bit different in terms of the psychological behaviors, because one thing that's quite possible with Les Arnold is that he didn't murder anyone after killing his parents. He might have done something that was wrong, or he made a mistake, he snapped and went too far, and then he just tried to run away from the past, broke out of prison, and maybe he didn't kill again. It's really hard to say because he's just described as an ordinary citizen living in New Zealand and Australia, so it really becomes quite difficult to try and pin this down. But what do you think about Les Arnold as a Zodiac killer suspect? You can weigh in the comments section down below. And today is Monday, though, so I'd also like to remind you guys that you can support this channel at BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And our first supporter is Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. And last week on the channel, I was talking about an image that had been shared with me from Batman66, and it was the Memento Mori patch, and it was a skeleton that was dodging bullets. And I thought about that the first time that I saw it, like, oh yeah, you can clearly see that the skeleton was dodging the bullets. But when I was discussing it on Zodiac Monday, for some reason I drew a mental blank, and I just said, the skeleton looks like he's dancing for some reason. And I don't know why I said that, because I guess I just had a quick lapse in judgment. But yes, to give credit where credit is due, that is something that is supposed to be military related, and the skeleton is dodging the bullets, just providing a line of clarity. But thank you, Batman66. Our next one comes to us from River Prawn Pottery, another regular and consistent supporter, River Prawn Pottery. Thank you so much. And next we have one from Dean Goldberry, who says, great show, Ned. And the next one is going to come to us from Sean and Zach on BuyMeACoffee.com, and it says, you still black box along, even when you've been unwell. So thanks for another episode, your commitment, and the consistent quality of your content. I mean, thank you so much. Last week, I was dealing with bronchitis, and the Zodiac Killer news report had to come out on Tuesday. Sometimes Zodiac Monday turns into a Zodiac Tuesday, but now I'm hoping that Tuesdays will be reserved for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, and I don't ever want to have bronchitis again. It's a rather miserable experience. I think that goes without saying, but Sean and Zach, thank you so much. And the final one comes to us from Plumley21, and there's not a message for this one on BuyMeACoffee.com, but Plumley21, thank you so much as well. And I would also like to give a shout out to Dennis G, who's been helping find a lot of the images for Black Box Online Radio that you see going by here on the screen. Thank you so much to Dennis G. So I said I wanted to talk to you guys about handwriting analysis. And there's another channel out there that follows the Zodiac Killer mystery that I talk about from time to time called Real Zodiac Killer Revealed, and it's run by Adam Ivester. And he put out a new video that told the story of Oba Chandler. And Oba Chandler was a murderer, serial killer, who was identified because someone recognized his handwriting. And Adam's strongest point in his Zodiac Killer expedition is handwriting, actually. His Zodiac Killer suspect is named John Parr Cox. He believes that he has matched John Parr Cox's handwriting to that of the Zodiac Killer. Now, the story of Oba Chandler is rather lengthy, and I'll discuss it in just a second. But do you agree or disagree with the statement that was discussed in that video, more or less the thesis question of the video, if we want to call it that, and that is that this case will be solved because somebody will recognize the killer's handwriting, and other people have tried some similar methods, actually. I'm reminded of discussing this with Sphere the Cube, Sphery as we call him, and Sphery has a suspect named Robert Volvins. One thing that he began to notice is looking at the linguistic similarities of Robert Volvins and the Zodiac Killer, as well as his family members, and it's really quite similar to how the Unabomber was caught. These are all Sphery's observations, by the way. The Unabomber was Ted Kaczynski, and as I said, he's a Zodiac Killer suspect, but he was identified because of linguistic similarities that were recognized by his brother. And with Oba Chandler, he was a serial killer, and he left behind a note that had some directions on it. And this is something that was even put up on billboards, and people were like, do you recognize this handwriting? And somebody recognized it, and that's how they caught the killer, because of just somebody looking at the handwriting sample that had been shared and pinning it to Oba Chandler. And I'll share a little bit of background information. Oba Chandler was born in 1946. He was an American serial killer and mass murderer who was convicted and executed for the June 1989 murders of Joan Rogers and her 2 daughters, whose bodies were found floating in Tampa Bay, Florida, with their hands and feet bound. Autopsies showed that the victims had been thrown into the water while still alive, with ropes tied to a concrete block around their necks. Absolutely terrible. I'm glad they caught the guy. The case became high profile in 1992 when local police posted billboards bearing enlarged images of the suspect's handwriting recovered from a pamphlet in the victim's car. Chandler was identified as the killer when his neighbor recognized the handwriting, and Oba Chandler primarily worked as an aluminum siding contractor. Prior to his arrest, Oba Chandler was an ordinary working individual. Against the advice of his attorneys, he testified in his defense, saying that he had met the Ohio women and had given them directions. Chandler said he never saw them again, except in newspaper coverage and on the billboards set up by authorities. Police originally theorized that 2 men were involved in the murders, but this was discounted once Oba Chandler was arrested. Following his conviction, Chandler was incarcerated at the Union Correctional Institution. During his 17 years of incarceration until his execution, he did not have a single visitor. Well, a lot of serial killers aren't exactly friendly types, where they don't actually have loved ones, if you can imagine. But, sometimes they do have close family members. Yes, sometimes you see people like Oba Chandler who have no one in their lives. But I was talking to you guys about the Golden State Killer. There's a famous story about him that after Joseph D'Angelo was arrested, his family went to visit him in jail, and he just said in a almost emotionless way, "Get out." He just didn't want to see them. Maybe that was done out of shame, or maybe it was done because he didn't actually have emotional bonds with them. It really is hard to tell. Oba Chandler was executed on November 15th of 2011. He wrote a last statement to prison officials saying, "You are killing an innocent man today." The statement was read at a post-execution news conference in February of 2014, and DNA evidence identified Chandler as the murderer of Evelise Barrios Bergeris, who was found dead in Coral Springs, Florida, on November 27th of 1990. And it's my understanding of this that Oba Chandler had some very similar handwriting well, I shouldn't say similar. He had a very distinct way of writing his letter Y. And I was just looking at the video that Adam had made for Real Zodiac Killer Revealed, and I was shocked. It's a very unique way of writing the letter Y. And, I think that if I had even seen that sample closely for one time, and I knew the person's name, like somebody like my neighbor, and my neighbor had written me a note, and it had a letter Y that looked like that, I don't think I would forget it. It's that unique. He also did something that was very different, and that is he would capitalize all of his letter T's, which are done in, you can see this when I post the images of his handwriting samples. He would capitalize the letter T when it wasn't necessary, when it should have been lowercase. He would also capitalize the letter A when it wasn't necessary and it should have been lowercase. Very, very strong similarities. So there are peculiarities about his handwriting that would give it away almost instantly that he was the killer. And if you were his neighbor and he had written you a note or something, yeah, that would stand out to you. And I think that was the complete intention of the police. Just saying, they're putting it on a billboard, for goodness sake. This is some very bizarre handwriting. It's a very different type of handwriting. Would anybody recognize it? And somebody did. Now, is that possible with the Zodiac Killer case? Maybe yes, maybe no. The Zodiac Killer definitely has some odd consistencies in his handwriting, like making the lowercase d with an external loop that is connected to a slanted, elongated line. There are almost 2 loops that form into the letter D. So, that is something that stands out, but that's not completely uncommon. And, John Parr Cox has very similar handwriting to that of the Zodiac Killer. I will give Adam credit for that, but a lot of other Zodiac Killer suspects have similar handwriting. Hal Snook would be another one. Hal Snook is a suspect of Thomas Henry Horan. Even Don Chaney had a lot of similar aspects of his handwriting. He would make the lowercase d's with the external loop connected to the slanted line. And I think that also, I found that there are also similarities between the handwriting of John Parr Cox and Hal Snook, like they would both make elongated lines with what Adam likes to call the PB hybrid. Okay, well, John Parr Cox talked about that in his discussions on mild dyslexia, but other Zodiac killer suspects would do that, where almost like a P and B form together. And Hal Snook also made elongated lines in his handwriting. A lot of Zodiac killer suspects have similar handwriting. Some people even think that Ted Kaczynski, whom I've mentioned multiple times in this episode, had very similar handwriting to that of the Zodiac killer. So I think that the Zodiac killer's handwriting is different, but I also think that it is something that isn't so different. It's not on the level of unique as Oba Chandler's, where you're not going to forget that. Someone who makes these types of Y shapes, someone who has this consistent level of blending capital A's and T's with lowercase letters. I mean, I told you I would recognize this very easily. But what do you think about the similarities in the stories? And also, the challenge question again. Do you believe that someone recognizing the handwriting will be the way that the Zodiac Killer mystery will be solved? And the final thing that I have for you here on Zodiac Monday is something that I confess goes into a different aspect of the true crime world. And there was a video that was made called Last Meals of Death Row Inmates that was done by Pure Data Comparison, and it talks about just some things that, the last meals that were eaten by people on death row. And I just wanted to use this as an example of how people spread misinformation online about the true crime world. And in the thumbnail, you can see an individual named Jeremy Morris, and it says that his last meal on death row was the Holy Bible. And, I mean, that is just simply untrue. Firstly, because I run this true crime channel, BlackBoxOnlineRadio, I've encountered that story multiple times, and that man is not even named Jeffrey Morris. His name is Michael Campbell, and he is a sex offender from Missouri. He is a real-life rapist, but he was never on death row. He is currently alive to this day, to the best of my knowledge, and again, his name is not Jeremy Morris, and, I mean, this is just pure misinformation. And you can even see Jeffrey Dahmer off to the side where it says, no last meal. I don't even know why they're talking about that, because Jeffrey Dahmer was murdered in prison. This is almost an irrelevant piece of information. That's like saying that some criminal who passed away in prison due to old age didn't have a last meal. Well, he wasn't even on death row. I mean, you could put anybody up there and just say they didn't have a last... I've never had a final meal on death row because I'm not awaiting execution. And this is called Pure Data Comparison. And it's just an example of how people spread misinformation and untrue things on YouTube. And there's a YouTube channel out there called Real Bad Things True Crime that talks about the Zodiac Killer rather frequently. And they did a video called The 5 Wildest, Most Ridiculous Zodiac Killer Theories, something to that effect. And, I mean, I just really found that the examples that they were talking about weren't very strong. So I wanted to save this for the end, just use it as a type of bonus material. I want to share with you guys the 5 most ridiculous theories that I've ever encountered in the Zodiac Killer mystery. And yes, number 1 is going to be Ted Cruz. They even began their episode talking about how, okay, the most wildest theory is Ted Cruz being the Zodiac. Now, the first one I wanted to talk to you guys about is Jack the Ripper. Yes, you might be thinking no one actually thinks that Jack the Ripper was the Zodiac Killer, right? Well, it's discussed in the book On the Trail of the Zodiac Killer by Francis J. Armstrong, where there's one sentence where it says, some people think that the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper were the same person, and it could have been Jack the Ripper's final hurrah, something to that effect. Well, Francis J. Armstrong, I don't know if anybody actually says that. You're the only person I've heard who's written that down. I've talked about the similarities between the two, but Jack the Ripper operated in 1888. That means he was not born in 1888. He would have been an adult male in 1888, so he would have been almost 100 years old at the time of the Zodiac crimes, and if he were alive, which is quite possible that he wasn't. I mean, it's highly unlikely that Jack the Ripper even lived to be 100. He was probably going insane because of syphilis or something like that. So he would be on the list. Then, you want to talk about ridiculous suspects? Okay, number 4. How about Santa Claus? What, you think I'm joking? You think I'm joking? Now, somebody wrote to me and said that they thought that Santa Claus was the Zodiac Killer. Okay, not the real Santa Claus. The guy who played Santa Claus for JonBenet Ramsey before she was murdered. And I know that someone shared their honest theory with me, but that has to go up there as well. Number 3, Max Headroom. A lot of you are familiar with the famous Max Headroom incident, and somebody contacted me as well saying that their Zodiac killer suspect was not the actor who played Max Headroom in the most famous TV hijacking where some people took control of a TV network and they played Max Headroom, or Max Headroom was someone was in a Max Headroom mask getting beaten on the ass with a fly swatter, and it wasn't the man in the mask, it wasn't the person playing Max Headroom, it was the director of the video, the director of Max Headroom's video hijacking. He was the Zodiac killer. And then, of course, we can say Ted Cruz. You know all about that. Ted Cruz gets talked about being the Zodiac killer, but of course, Ted Cruz was born in 1970. But there may even be a more ridiculous suspect, and that is Ned DeHaan. I mean, some people have written about me in the comments section saying, you know what, if Ted Cruz can be the Zodiac killer, maybe Ned is the Zodiac killer too. So those would be my 5 most ridiculous Zodiac killer theories. If you actually want an honest answer about the 5 most ridiculous theories in the Zodiac killer mystery, you can also share any ridiculous Zodiac killer theories that you have heard. And anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also use that email address to send me larger things like attachments and photos, and that's a great way to get in touch. You can also use my personal Facebook, which is in the description box, and Instagram, BlackBoxNet88. And as previously stated, I release shorts and reels almost every day on Facebook and Instagram. Ned DeHaan on Facebook, BlackBoxNet88 on Instagram, and I will see you over there. Goodbye.